Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Ogden, and I recently finished my PhD at the University of Southampton, and I'm here talking today with Emily Maemura, who's at the University of Toronto, to talk through our paper, A Tale of Two Web Archives, Challenges of Engaging Web Archival Infrastructures for Research. And here we're going to work through our development of a conceptual framework to think through researcher activities at the earliest stages of web archival research within the National Web Archive context. So just going to dive on in here. As we all know, web archives are a potentially key resource for web-based research, with a slew of recent anthologies and publications that provide us with examples of their use in a wide range of disciplines. Much of this work has drawn on large-scale collections as well as national web archives. And while this scholarship definitely identifies opportunities, it's also identified a persistent, what could be called a socio-technical gap between the needs of researchers and the affordances of current web archival research infrastructures. And many of these challenges will be familiar to this community, particularly surrounding the kind of legal deposit access restrictions, provenance, as well as open ethical questions, and the availability of tools. And it's in this socio-technical gap that our paper is situated through the lens of two case studies at two European national web archives. The first of which is the UK Web Archive, which I'm sure most of you know is composed of 6 UK legal deposit libraries responsible for archiving the UK web space. The UK Web Archive has a series of domain crawling as well as selective and targeted special collections activities that span subject areas, as well as a history of hosting projects around researcher engagement that includes building data sets as well as tools to encourage humanities and social science research, for example, the Boté project. So my project was within the context of a 3-month placement, which was funded by the UKRI ESRC National Centre for Research Methods. So I was based at the UK Web Archive at the British Library, which was looking at what social science researchers need to know about collections. And this work formed the foundations for a case study on the discursive representations of immigration and migration within UK news, which led to a focus on the news special collection and the hyperlocal news special collection specifically. The second site was the site of the Net Archive, or the Danish National Web Archive, which is based at the Royal Library, which is a collaboration between the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen and the State and University Library in Aarhus to archive the Danish National Web under legal deposit. And this setup has created a close relationship between the library and researchers from NetLab at Aarhus University. And this is where Emily spent 3 months studying curation and provenance within the collections as part of her doctoral research in 2018. In both studies, we included on-site fieldwork, which included observations as well as interviews with library curators, developers, researchers, and managers. And so in this paper, we really wanted to compare and contrast our experiences of undertaking research within these two national web archives to consider the sort of socio-technical and organizational constraints of web archiving and their impact on the nature of our research. So in an effort to inform future research in this space, we've developed this conceptual framework to surround and structure the sort of challenges that researchers engage with when working within the National Web Archive context. And broadly speaking, there's been, we were inspired by wider work that's happened in this space, which is attended to kind of understanding humanities and social science information work that underpin common scholarly activities. So this is probably best embodied by the notion of so-called scholarly primitives, or what they would call the basic functions common to scholarly activity across humanities disciplines. So here Unsworth originally developed this concepts of discovering, annotating, comparing, or referring, which has been expanded by many within digital humanities to look at specific infrastructure or technology interventions that facilitate these practices within digital research. Other work in web archives, we can look towards the FEVE model, that's the filter, extract, aggregate, and visualize, which was developed in conjunction with the Archives Unleashed toolkit. And basically this kind of previous work has often been used to develop or inform technology or tool development within the space, and it often begins at the stage where researchers are trying to use tools to filter or extract data from collections. Whereas here we really wanted to look at the earliest stages of the research process to consider the kinds of support that are needed to develop expertise in training and access models, and then also look at to what extent these infrastructures in turn actually shape the research process. And so the initial kind of concepts that we're working with here are orientating, auditing, and constructing. And just to sort of reiterate, these are this isn't really a linear workflow or a fixed set of practices, but they necessarily sort of overlap in ways that reflect the iterative and complex and often exploratory ways that researchers engage with web archival research. So to jump in, orientating first sort of acknowledges the difficulties that researchers may even have coming to grips with the nature of what a web archive is, and the ways in which this can actually be a major challenge within the National Web Archival context. We also are looking at kind of ways here in which researchers have to grapple with key concepts that have been transposed from paper-based archives, but also been combined to terminology that's really particular to web archiving, so thinking through notions of crawling and captures and seeds, and then understanding how those different approaches then impact the nature of collection activities, for example, snapshots, and how that then has impact upon the interpretation of search results and subsequent analysis. They also obviously unpick the kind of complex legal access restraints, which can be different across each national web archive. But it also, here we wanted to capture the ways in which researchers have to critically engage with their own preconceived notions of what a web archive is, or what so-called big data research might be, and how that may or may not translate to the use of these kinds of web archival resources, particularly in the National Web Archive context. And this often requires acclimatizing to the scale of the national collection compared to perhaps kind of previous experience, at least in our own cases, with working with sort of smaller archivic collections, for example. And here we wanted to also kind of think about the conceptual challenges that can arise surrounding the translation of the various and many understandings of what the nature of collection is, and how this is situated within different web archives. So here we were also thinking through auditing, which really in some ways is engaging with the various collection practices and search interfaces that are presented within web archives that make it difficult to see collections in the round or from a vantage point that gives a sense of where the boundaries of the archive lies. So here researchers may want to be interested in capturing the histories of how particular archives come to be and where the gaps are that might impact the nature of potential use. And so here we in both cases found real value in engaging with the curatorial infrastructure that surrounds National Web Archive collections. So in my case, that was looking at the ACT tool, which curators use to curate special collections. But in addition to that, actually engaging with curators, in my case the news curator, but as well as developers and managers who are working within the collection's development to understand the nature of that collection. And so in my case, and this is what these sort of images are displaying, that was sort of experimenting with plotting and visualizing curator practices for the special collection I was working with, which was the hyperlocal news collection. And through this modeling work and these conversations, I was able to sort of build up a model of where the edges and the parameters of the collection were. For example, I was looking at the geographic distribution of the collection. So in addition, we're thinking through constructing as another conceptual device, and here we're really thinking about the kind of ways in which, or the activities rather, that surround the creation of a subset of data to work through and to perform kind of focused analyses. And often this means sort of navigating different interfaces and different technical infrastructure to select and aggregate resources across collections, or indeed harvesting collections, as well as looking through different kinds of research methods given data availability. And so here it's really all about kind of creating a kind of stable data set to perform an analysis with. And this might, in some cases, enable you to create sort of custom scripting or applications, but really it's about demarcating where the boundaries of your analysis are. And here there can be, and at least in our case, kind of concerns around the nature of pre-existing special collections, where archives may not directly map to the substantive or methodological needs of particular research agendas. And it might require, again, sort of aggregating together data across collections as well as archive sources, and indeed institutional mandates for collection. So in addition to this, researchers might also want to be able to explain the methods and the selection criteria that underlie the creation of those specific data sources. So just to kind of wrap up with our last slide here in discussion and the conclusions, a kind of core contribution of presenting and analyzing this work through this conceptual framework is really a greater recognition of the significant time and energy required on the part of researchers for engaging National Web Archives. And our experiences really point to the need for creative interventions and workarounds for adapting pre-existing digital research methodologies in the Web Archive, National Web Archive environment. And we argue that these archival engagements therefore really require dialogue with curators, as well as time, subject and technical expertise, and often the optimism, in the words of Donna Haraway, to stay with the trouble and in the face of major obstacles to use. To this end, our work really points to the value of engaging curatorial infrastructure that surrounds the creation of web archives, and the importance of curators' involvement in the discussions at the earliest stages of research. And here these curatorial infrastructures really speak to the affordances of web archives and the potential implications this has for research use. And finally, our experiences also point to the need to address how each access interface and point of entry to the web archive serves to frame these resources in specific kinds of ways, potentially constraining the types of questions that may be asked. And it's really evident from our initial explorations that interfaces guide researchers, at least implicitly, to structure analysis that is more readily available through default values in the data, for example, counts, domain counts, as opposed to the sort of inherently ambiguous steps in arriving at something that might be closer to their own research aims. And here, although we definitely recognize the resource constraints of most web archiving programs, ultimately the value of curators engaging with researchers directly at the earliest stages of research should really not be underestimated. Overall, we hope that future work will further consider these earliest stages of the research process with a view towards developing collaborative environments for researchers to work with the socio-technical infrastructure of National Web Archives. So thanks a lot, and here we just want to acknowledge some of the funders from our research projects, as well as our references, and thanks for listening, and we'd be happy to take any questions you might have.